I'm 62 now, and I've held this inside me for almost 22 years. Long enough that the edges of it have blurred, but not the weight. I saved something in the winter of 2002, something I had no business even touching. And this November, it came back, fully grown. It remembered me. It remembered everything. I know people toss around the word Bigfoot like it's a joke, but what stood at the edge of my property wasn't a story. It brought something that, well, after you hear this, you'll understand why I can't keep quiet anymore. My name is Jake Henderson. In January of 2002, I was 40 years old, recently divorced, and working as a commercial fisherman out of Happy Camp, California. The Klamath River had been my life since I was 16, and that winter it nearly became my grave. Or at least, it should have been someone else's. The floods that year were biblical. We're talking water levels nobody had seen since the 50s. The county hired me on as a temporary contractor to monitor debris flow at the lower access points, make sure the gauging stations stayed clear, that kind of thing. Grunt work, really, but it kept me out on the river, and that's where I needed to be. My ex-wife had taken the house in Eureka, and I'd moved into my uncle's old cabin about 8 miles upriver from town. 1 room, a wood stove, and enough silence to drown in. It was a Tuesday, January 15th, around 3 in the afternoon. The sky was that flat gray color you get after days of rain, and the river was running high and fast, chewing at the banks like it was hungry. I was clearing storm-felled branches from the access path, dragging Douglas fir limbs the size of my leg off to the side so the county truck could get through the next morning. My hands were numb even through the work gloves, and I could feel the cold working its way up through my boots. That's when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Sharp, rhythmic, a barking wail that cut straight through the roar of the floodwater. My first thought was a dog, maybe, or a calf that had gotten loose from one of the ranches upstream. But it was wrong. The pitch was too high, too desperate, and it had this quality to it that made the hair on my neck stand up. Then came the thump. Heavy. Like something big had been thrown against rock. I dropped the branch I was holding and moved toward the sound. The smell hit me before I saw anything. Wet earth and musky hair, thick enough to taste. Not the sour rot of a dead animal, but something alive and terrified. I pushed through a stand of willow saplings and came out on the upper embankment, maybe 20 feet above the swollen river. The water was brown and violent, full of debris, tree limbs spinning in the current like matchsticks. At first, I thought it was a bear cub wedged against a half-submerged cedar trunk, dark fur matted with mud and river foam. But then it moved, and I saw the hand. A hand, not a paw. It was 3 times the width of my own, with long fingers that ended in blunt nails, and it was slapping weakly at the water, trying to find purchase on the slick bark of the trunk. The current kept pulling it under, then shoving it back up, and with each cycle, I could see more. A small body covered in deep chestnut fur, arms too long for the torso, and then, for just a second, as the water fell away, I saw its face. I'm not going to dress this up. It was humanoid, infant-like. The eyes were huge and dark, set wide in a flat face, and when they found mine, they were full of intelligence, full of fear. It made that barking wail again, weaker this time, and reached toward me with one trembling hand. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to back away, to get in my truck and drive straight to the county office and report what I'd found. This was beyond me, beyond anything I understood. But standing there on that embankment, watching that tiny hand stretch toward me, I didn't see a monster. I saw something that was going to die if I didn't move. I climbed down. The rocks were slick with moss and spray, and twice I nearly lost my footing. The water was so loud I couldn't hear my own breathing, just that awful roar and the creature's exhausted churring. When I got close enough, I could see it was tangled in a mess of fishing line and deadfall, one arm pinned against its side. Its eyes never left my face. I reached out slowly, talking to it, even though I knew it couldn't understand me. "Easy there, easy. I've got you." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, high and tight with adrenaline. The creature didn't pull away. It made a soft, almost questioning sound, and then its free hand closed around my forearm. The grip was incredible, not painful, but strong enough that I knew, even weakened and half-drowned as it was, this thing could have hurt me if it wanted to. But it didn't. It held on like a child holds on to a parent, and something in my chest cracked open. I got my knife out and cut through the fishing line, working as fast as I could while the water tried to rip us both off the rocks. The creature whimpered when I pulled the line free from its matted fur, and I saw a deep gash across its left shoulder, bleeding sluggishly. The moment it was loose, it wrapped both arms around my neck and buried its face against my coat. It took me nearly 10 minutes to get us both back up the embankment. The creature couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, but it was dead weight, clinging to me with the last of its strength. By the time I reached level ground, my legs were shaking and my lungs were burning. I looked down at the tiny face pressed against my shoulder, at the silver streak of exposed skin where the debris had torn through its fur, and I made a choice that would define the rest of my life. I carried it to my truck, wrapped it in my coat, and drove home. You have to understand why I did what I did. This wasn't some impulsive act of kindness. Or maybe it was. But it came from a place deeper than logic. I'd spent the better part of a year feeling like a failure. My marriage had ended because I couldn't give my ex-wife the life she wanted, couldn't be the man she needed. I'd retreated to that cabin like a wounded animal, and for months I'd felt responsible for nothing and no one. And then suddenly, I was responsible for everything. If I'd reported what I found, that creature would have ended up in a lab or a cage. Best case scenario, it would have spent its life being studied, poked, measured. Worst case, someone would have put a bullet in it just to prove it existed. I'd worked with enough government agencies to know how these things go. They don't ask questions first. They secure the asset. I couldn't do it. Call it instinct, call it stupidity, call it whatever you want. But holding that small, terrified creature in my arms felt like the first right thing I'd done in a long time. My uncle's cabin sat on 43 acres of mixed forest, half a mile from the nearest neighbor, a retired couple who minded their own business. Behind the main structure was an old smokehouse he'd used for salmon, about 12 feet square with a wood plank floor and a rusted stovepipe. I'd been using it for storage, mostly tools and fishing gear I didn't have room for inside. I cleared it out in under an hour, laid down every blanket and sleeping bag I owned, dragged in a kerosene heater, filled a plastic basin with warm water. The creature hadn't moved since I'd set it down. It lay curled on its side, breathing in shallow gasps, its eyes half closed. The gash on its shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the edges were ragged and dirty. I cleaned the wound as best I could with hydrogen peroxide and gauze. The creature flinched but didn't fight me. When I was done, I offered it water in a tin cup. It stared at the cup for a long moment, then took it with both hands and drank in quick, desperate gulps. I gave it more. Then I sat back against the wall and just watched it, this impossible thing that was now my responsibility. It fell asleep around midnight. I stayed awake, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof and wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, pale winter light was seeping through the gaps in the wallboards, and the creature was sitting up, watching me with those enormous dark eyes. "Morning," I said, my voice rough with sleep. It tilted its head, made a soft sound, almost like a question. I held up my hands, palms out, trying to show I meant no harm. "You're safe here. Understand? Safe." It blinked slowly, then mimicked the gesture, holding up its own oversized hands. And I swear, in that moment, I saw something like understanding pass across its face. Over the next 3 days, I called in sick to the county job and focused on keeping my unexpected guest alive. It ate constantly. Fish mostly, since I had plenty from my freezer, but also bread, apples, peanut butter, straight from the jar. I started calling it Ripple, after the river that had nearly taken its life. Seemed fitting. Ripple learned fast. Within a week, it understood that 3 knocks on the smokehouse door meant I was coming in. It figured out how to work the latch on the water basin. When I showed it how to stack the firewood by size, it not only copied me, but improved on my method, creating a more stable structure. This wasn't an animal. This was something else entirely. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't tell anyone. My ex-wife and I weren't speaking. My fishing buddies thought I was going through a rough patch and gave me space. The county assumed I was dealing with divorce depression, and I was in a way, but not how they thought. I was living a double life, and the weight of it was suffocating. In late February, my neighbor, Tom Ridley, stopped by unannounced with a casserole his wife had made. I saw his truck coming up the drive and barely had time to lock the smokehouse and throw a tarp over the entrance before he knocked. We stood on the porch making small talk about the weather while Ripple stayed silent 20 yards away, and I prayed it wouldn't make a sound. Tom noticed the tarp. Doing some work back there? Housing a couple stray dogs I found down by the river, I said, the lie coming easier than I expected. Getting them healthy before I take them to the shelter in Eureka? He nodded, satisfied. You always were a soft touch for strays, Jake. If he only knew. Spring came late that year. The floods receded, and the Klamath settled back into its banks, leaving behind a landscape of mud and broken trees. Ripple was growing, fast. By March, it had nearly doubled in size, its limbs lengthening, its chest broadening. The deep chestnut fur had thickened, and the silver streak across its left shoulder had hardened into a pale scar. It was stronger, too. I watched it lift a 100-pound section of firewood one-handed, moving it like it weighed nothing. We developed a routine. Mornings, I'd bring breakfast to the smokehouse, scrambled eggs, toast, whatever fruit I had on hand. Ripple would eat while I worked on chores around the property, clearing brush, repairing the fence line. Sometimes it would watch me through the cracks in the wall, those dark eyes following my every move. Other times it would sleep, curled into a ball like a child. Afternoons, I'd return to my fishing contracts, and Ripple would be alone. I left it books, not because I thought it could read, but because it seemed to like looking at the pictures. Field guides mostly, birds, plants, mammals. It would sit for hours, carefully turning pages with its massive fingers, studying the images with an intensity that unnerved me. Evenings were ours. I'd bring dinner and we'd eat together, sitting on opposite sides of the smokehouse. I'd talk about my day, tell stories about fishing, about my failed marriage, about growing up on the river. Ripple would listen, its head cocked, sometimes making soft vocalizations that almost sounded like questions. I started to think of it as companionship, the loneliness that had been eating at me since the divorce began to ease. But it couldn't last. I knew that. In June, I made a mistake. I'd bought a 6-pack of Coors Light at the general store in Happy Camp, and the clerk, Denise Murray, made a comment about me stocking up. "You expecting company, Jake?" "Just me," I said, trying to sound casual. "Long week." She smiled, but there was curiosity in her eyes. "Heard you got some dogs out at your place. Tom Ridley mentioned it." "Just temporary, till I can get them to a shelter." "Tom said he heard them barking last week, said it sounded strange." My blood went cold. Ripple didn't bark. It made sounds, yes, but not like any dog. If Tom had heard something, if people were starting to notice, I needed to be more careful. I bought the beer and left, drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back to the cabin, I found Ripple standing at the smokehouse window, its face pressed against the glass, staring out at the forest. It looked at me when I approached, and I saw something in its expression that I'd been dreading. Loneliness. The same loneliness I'd been running from. "I know," I said quietly. "I know this isn't enough." That night, I heard them for the first time. Calls from the ridge above my property. Deep, resonant vocalizations that echoed through the trees like whale song. Ripple heard them too. It stood at the door of the smokehouse, pressing its hands against the wood, making answering sounds that were softer, almost pleading. Its family. They were looking for it. The calls continued for 3 nights. Each time, Ripple became more agitated, pacing the smokehouse, churring and keening. On the 4th night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep it locked up forever. It deserved a choice. I opened the door. Ripple stood in the doorway, looking at me, then at the forest, then back at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then it stepped outside, its bare feet silent on the dirt. It walked to the edge of the clearing, stopped, and looked back one more time. I raised my hand, a simple gesture. "Goodbye." Ripple raised its hand in return, and then it disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, going cold in my hands, listening to the forest and feeling the weight of what I'd just done. I'd saved its life, and now I'd let it go. It was the right choice. The only choice? But it still felt like losing something I hadn't known I needed. For weeks, the smokehouse sat empty. I cleaned it out, put my tools back, tried to return to normal. But normal felt hollow now. I went through the motions of work, of living, but my mind kept drifting back to those dark eyes, those careful hands, that tilt of the head when Ripple was trying to understand something. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late, say, August, I found the first gift. It was sitting on my porch when I came out to get firewood. A perfect arrangement of river stones, stacked in a cairn about a foot high. I'd seen cairns before, left by hikers as trail markers, but this one was on my porch, and I hadn't built it. I looked out at the forest, saw nothing, but I felt watched. "Ripple?" I called out, feeling foolish. No answer, just the wind in the pines. Over the next few months, more gifts appeared, a cluster of hawk feathers tied with grass, a smooth piece of driftwood sanded by the river into an almost perfect oval. A rainbow trout, gutted and cleaned, laid on a flat stone near my woodpile. Each time, I'd search the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of that chestnut fur, that silver scar. But Ripple never showed itself. It was watching over me, protecting me from a distance. I started leaving gifts in return, jars of peanut butter, bags of apples. Once, a harmonica I'd found in my uncle's things, thinking maybe Ripple would like the sound. The items would disappear within a day or two, and new gifts would take their place. We were communicating across the boundary of species, across the divide between my world and whatever world Ripple now inhabited. It went on like that for years. A silent, secret friendship maintained through tokens and offerings. Winter turned to spring, turned to summer, turned to fall. The Bush administration gave way to Obama. The economy collapsed in 2008, and suddenly the forest was full of hunters, desperate men looking for anything they could sell or eat. I started carrying my rifle when I walked my property, not to hunt, but to make noise, to warn Ripple away when strangers were near. One afternoon in October 2008, I came across boot prints near the old smokehouse. Fresh prints, size 11 or 12, accompanied by the distinctive pattern of hunting treads. Someone had been here. Close? I followed the tracks to the edge of my property where they met up with 2 more sets of prints. 3 men. They'd been moving together, probably following game trails. At the boundary line, I found a trail camera strapped to a dug fir, its little red light blinking steadily. My heart hammered. If that camera had caught anything unusual, if Ripple had passed by in the last few days, these men would see it. They'd come back. They'd bring more people. I took the camera, smashed the SD card under my boot heel. Then I hung a handwritten sign on the tree. Private property. No hunting. Trespassers will be prosecuted. That night, I heard Ripple's call from the ridge. 3 short vocalizations, then silence. I stepped out onto my porch and called back, cupping my hands around my mouth, trying to match the tone. I don't know if it understood, but I hoped it did. Danger. Stay away. The gift stopped for nearly 2 years after that. By 2010, I was 48 years old, and the river was starting to win. My knees ached in the cold. My hands didn't grip the way they used to. I'd started thinking about retirement, about what I'd do when fishing wasn't an option anymore. The cabin felt smaller every year, and the silence I'd once craved now felt oppressive. Then, on a frozen January morning, Ripple saved my life. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin when I heard the scream. Not a human scream, a mountain lion. I looked up and saw it on the roof of the smokehouse, maybe 30 yards away, its tail twitching as it watched me. I'd left my rifle inside. Stupid. The cat crouched, muscles bunching, and I knew I had maybe 2 seconds before it launched. It never got the chance. Something massive exploded out of the tree line. I caught a flash of chestnut fur, the glint of a silver scar, and then Ripple was between me and the cat, standing at its full height. I'd never seen it upright before. It had to be close to 8 feet tall, shoulders broad as a barrel, arms hanging down past its knees. It opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. A roar that started low and built into something that shook my ribcage, a sound full of rage and warning. The mountain lion bolted, just turned and ran, disappearing into the forest like it had never been there. Ripple turned to me. Its face had changed since I'd last seen it up close. More mature, more defined, but the eyes were the same. Intelligent, concerned. Jesus, I managed. You're huge. It made a soft huffing sound, almost like laughter, then reached out and touched my shoulder. Gentle, checking to make sure I was okay. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, moving with that same eerie silence I remembered from years ago. I stood there for a long time after it left, my heart gradually slowing, my hands still shaking. Ripple hadn't forgotten me. After all these years, it was still watching, still protecting. 2 days later, a group of hikers found deep tracks in the snow about a quarter mile from my property. They reported them to the Forest Service, claimed they looked like bear tracks but bigger, deeper. The ranger who came out to investigate stopped at my cabin, asked if I'd seen anything unusual. "Black bear," I said without hesitation. "Big one. Saw it a few days back near the ridge. It'll move on when the weather warms." He seemed satisfied with that, but I started being more careful, started watching for drones, for cameras, for any sign that people were getting too curious about what lived in these woods. The years blurred together after that. 2011, 2012, 2013. I kept fishing, kept living my quiet life, kept finding Ripple's gifts and leaving my own. Sometimes months would pass without any sign. Other times I'd wake to find fresh tracks circling my cabin as if Ripple had spent the night keeping watch. In 2014, something changed. I'd been struggling with a broken bucket I used to haul water from the well. The metal handle had snapped clean off, and I couldn't figure out how to reattach it without welding equipment I didn't own. I'd left the bucket on the porch, meaning to drive into town and buy a new one, but kept putting it off. One morning in June, I found the bucket repaired. The handle had been reattached using a piece of flexible willow branch woven through the metal loops in a pattern I'd never seen before. It was elegant, functional, better than the original design. I picked up the bucket, tested the handle. It held firm. Ripple had made this, not just found something and brought it to me, but actually repaired a broken tool, demonstrated an understanding of function and materials that went beyond simple mimicry. I sat down on the porch steps, holding that bucket, and felt the full weight of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just an intelligent creature. This was a being with culture, with learned skills passed down through generations. Ripple's people had technology or something like it. They built things, they solved problems, and we were destroying their home. The logging had been getting worse since 2012. Regional policy changes had opened up more of the old-growth forest to commercial harvest, and I'd been watching the clear cuts creep closer to my property, closer to the deep woods where I knew Ripple's family lived. The sound of chainsaws echoed through the valley most mornings, and at night I could see the lights of the logging camps on the distant ridges. I started making trips into town more often, attending county meetings, filing complaints about the expansion. People thought I'd become an environmental nut, one of those old-timers who couldn't accept that the world was changing. But I wasn't fighting for the trees. I was fighting for Ripple. The gifts continued. A nest of soft moss left by my door during a particularly cold winter. A branch of wild blackberries, the fruit so ripe it was almost bursting. Once, a complete bird skeleton arranged with such care that it looked like a museum piece. Each gift felt like a conversation, a way of saying, "I'm still here. I remember." And I remembered too. By 2016, the logging crews had cut within a mile of my property line. I'd wake to the sound of trucks rumbling past on the old fire road, hauling out loads of dug fir and cedar. The forest was getting quieter, fewer birds, fewer deer. The ecosystem was collapsing, and with it, Ripple's world. I saw it only once that year, late in December. I was walking the boundary of my property, checking for new trail cameras, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Ripple was standing in a stand of hemlock about 50 yards away, partially obscured by shadow. It didn't approach, just stood there, watching me. I raised my hand, the old gesture. "Hello, I'm here." Ripple raised its hand in return, then it melted back into the trees. That was the last time I saw it for nearly 4 years. The pandemic hit in 2020, and the world went quiet in a different way. No logging crews, no hikers, no trucks on the fire road. Just silence and isolation, the kind I'd sought 20 years earlier. But that now felt suffocating. I was 58 years old, alone in a cabin in the woods, and for the first time since Ripple had entered my life, I felt truly lonely. That's when the visits started again. The first one was in April, just after my birthday. I'd been sitting on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the rain, when I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. I looked up, and there was Ripple, standing at the edge of the clearing, rain streaming down its fur. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then Ripple made a sound, low and mournful, a vocalization that seemed to carry all the grief of the past year, all the isolation and fear and uncertainty. And I understood. It was lonely too. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "I know, I feel it too." Ripple came closer, stopping about 10 feet from the porch. It sat down, cross-legged, like a person might, and we just sat together, two lonely beings sharing space in a world that had gone strange and quiet. It started visiting regularly after that, once a week, sometimes more. We never touched, never got too close, but the presence was enough. Sometimes I'd talk, rambling about my day, about the news I'd heard on the radio, about memories from before. Ripple would listen, occasionally making soft sounds that felt like responses. In July, I lost someone. An old fishing buddy named Marco died of COVID. We hadn't been close in years, but hearing about his death hit me harder than I expected. That night, I sat on the porch and cried for the first time since my divorce. Just let it all out. The grief and fear and exhaustion. Ripple showed up around midnight. I heard the footsteps and looked up to see it standing in the moonlight, its expression somber. It came closer than it ever had before, sat down right in front of me, and made that same mournful vocalization it had made months earlier. And I realized it was grieving with me, sharing the weight of loss in the only way it could. I put my hand on the porch railing. Ripple put its hand next to mine, not touching, but close. We sat like that for hours until the sky started to lighten and the birds began to sing. Then Ripple stood, touched 2 fingers to its chest, and walked back into the forest. I sat there after it left, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Connection, real, profound connection with another living being. And it didn't matter that we were different species. It didn't matter that we couldn't speak the same language. We understood each other in the ways that mattered. The world started opening up again in 2021 and 2022. The logging crews came back. The hikers returned. And with them came a new threat: drones. Consumer drones had been around for years, but suddenly everyone had one. I'd see them buzzing through the forest, little mechanical insects with cameras, piloted by people who had no idea what they might accidentally document. I started carrying a long pole with a net attached, knocking drones out of the sky when they flew over my property. Got threatened with a lawsuit once, but I didn't care. Ripple's safety was worth more than any legal trouble. The visits became less frequent. Ripple was being cautious, and I didn't blame it. The forest wasn't safe anymore. Too many eyes, too much technology. I worried constantly that someone would see it, photograph it, turn it into a spectacle. I started sleeping worse. The hypervigilance I'd felt in those early years returned, amplified by age and exhaustion. I'd wake at every sound, every crack of a branch, convinced that this was the night someone would come with cameras or guns or worse. By 2024, I was 62 and feeling every year of it. My fishing contracts had dwindled. The river didn't call to me the way it used to. I spent most of my days just maintaining the cabin, reading, listening to the forest, waiting. Then November came. It was a Thursday evening, November 7th. The sun was setting early, painting the sky that particular shade of orange that only happens in late autumn. I was on the porch, like always, when I heard the footsteps. But this time, there were 2 sets. Ripple emerged from the tree line, and my breath caught. It was fully grown now, massive and powerful, moving with a grace that defied its size. The silver scar across its shoulder was visible even in the fading light. But it wasn't alone. Next to it, smaller but unmistakably similar, was a younger one. A juvenile, maybe 7 feet tall, with darker fur and the same intelligent eyes. Ripple's child. They approached slowly, stopping at the usual distance. Ripple made a soft vocalization, then motioned to the younger one, who stepped forward nervously and held out its hands. In them was something wrapped in woven plant fiber, bound with such care that I knew immediately it was important. I stood up, my legs shaking, walked down the porch steps. The juvenile watched me with a mixture of fear and curiosity, but it didn't run. It had been taught to trust me. Ripple had taught it. I took the bundle gently. The fiber was soft, made from stripped willow bark and grass, woven in an intricate pattern. I unwrapped it slowly, my hands trembling. Inside was a fishing lure, river blue and silver, the same one I'd been using the night I found Ripple in the flood, the one I'd lost in the chaos of the rescue. It was weathered but intact, obviously preserved with care for more than 2 decades. But that wasn't all. Wrapped around the lure was a braid, a cord about a foot long, made from 2 different types of hair woven together. One was coarse and dark, Ripple's hair, the other was gray and fine. My hair. I looked up at Ripple, my vision blurring with tears. "You kept this, all these years." Ripple reached out slowly and pressed one enormous hand to my chest, right over my heart. Then it pressed the same hand to its own chest. The gesture was clear. Family. I held the braid to my chest and nodded. Yeah, family. Ripple made a sound, something between a purr and a hum, and I realized it was contentment. Then it stepped back and gestured to the younger one again. The juvenile came forward, hesitant, and touched my hand briefly before darting back to Ripple's side. And I understood. This wasn't just a visit. This was an introduction. Ripple was teaching its child about me, about the human who had saved its life, about the bond that existed between us. It was passing down the story, the way families do. We stood there together as the sky darkened, three beings from two different worlds, connected by a single act of compassion from 22 years ago. Then Ripple made a low vocalization, and they turned to go. But before they disappeared into the trees, Ripple looked back at me one more time and raised its hand. I raised mine, and then they were gone. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the porch, holding the braid and the fishing lure, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of it was enormous. For 22 years, I'd carried this secret alone, convinced that I'd done something reckless and foolish, something that could only end in tragedy. But Ripple had shown me something different. What I'd done mattered. Not just to me, not just to Ripple, but to the next generation. To Ripple's child, who now knew that not all humans were threats, that some of us could be trusted, that kindness could cross the boundary of species. Over the next few days, I started noticing tracks, small ones at the edge of my property, always in pairs. Ripple and its child were nearby, watching, teaching. I'd catch glimpses sometimes, just shadows moving through the trees, but enough to know they were there. And then, on November 14th, I found something that changed everything. I was checking the northern boundary, near where the old fire road met my property line, when I saw the prints. Fresh ones. But these weren't Ripple's tracks or the juveniles. These were boot prints, multiple sets, along with tire treads from an ATV. And next to them, stakes driven into the ground with orange survey tape tied to them. Someone was marking land for development. My stomach dropped. I followed the stakes for nearly a quarter mile, watching them march through the forest in a straight line, cutting through the deep woods where I knew Ripple's family lived. At the end of the line, I found a notice nailed to a tree. Public comment period for proposed logging expansion. 60 days to file objections. I stood there staring at that notice, feeling 22 years of protection crumbling around me. If they started cutting here, Ripple's family would be driven out. Or worse, they'd be exposed, photographed, hunted. That night, I heard them calling. The whole family group from the sound of it. 4 or 5 distinct voices echoing through the valley in that haunting, mournful way. They knew. They could sense what was coming. I made a decision then, one I'd been avoiding for 2 decades. The next morning, I drove into Happy Camp and bought a video camera. Nothing fancy, just a basic handheld model from Walmart, $139 and change. I set it up on my porch, angled toward the clearing, and waited. Ripple came that night. It approached slowly, stopping when it saw the camera, its body tense. I held up my hands. "It's okay. I need to do this. People need to see that you're real, that you deserve protection." Ripple tilted its head, studying the camera. Then it looked at me, and I saw understanding in its eyes. It knew what I was asking, what I was risking. It stepped into the camera's view. For nearly 10 minutes, I filmed. Ripple standing in the moonlight, moving with that impossible grace, turning to show the silver scar, the proof of our shared history. At one point, it picked up one of the gifts it had left me years ago, a smooth river stone, and placed it carefully on the porch railing. A gesture of trust. When it was done, Ripple came close to the camera, so close that its face filled the frame. It looked directly into the lens, and I swear it was looking at everyone who would ever watch this, saying, "I'm here, I'm real, I matter." Then it turned and disappeared into the forest. I watched the footage that night, my hands shaking. It was clear, undeniable. Ripple was there, in full detail, moving in ways that no costume or CGI could replicate. This was proof, real proof, and I couldn't release it. I sat there with my finger hovering over the delete button, thinking about what would happen if this video got out. Ripple would become famous. Its forest would be flooded with researchers, documentary crews, hunters wanting to prove themselves. The logging company would use it as an excuse to clear the land faster, claiming they were removing habitat for a dangerous animal. Ripple's family would be destroyed. Everything I'd protected for 22 years would be gone. I deleted the footage, all of it. Then I took the camera outside and smashed it with a splitting maul until it was just pieces of plastic and glass. But I kept the SD card, locked it in a fireproof safe in my closet, along with the braid and the fishing lure, just in case someday the world changed enough that the truth could be told safely. 3 days later, I drove to the county office and filed my objection to the logging expansion. I attended the public hearing, spoke for my allotted 3 minutes, argued that the old growth forest was critical habitat for endangered species. I didn't mention Bigfoot. I didn't need to. The environmentalists were already fighting this battle, and I added my voice to theirs. It wasn't enough. The expansion was approved in January 2025. Logging was scheduled to begin in early spring. I spent the winter preparing, stockpiled food, checked and rechecked my property boundaries, started making plans for what I'd do if things went bad, if Ripple's family was discovered, if I needed to intervene somehow. But Ripple never came back. The last time I saw it was that night in November, standing in front of my camera, trusting me with its image. Since then, nothing. No gifts, no tracks, just silence. The logging started in March. I could hear the chainsaws from my porch, a constant whine that made my teeth ache. The trucks rolled past my driveway every morning, hauling out loads of ancient timber. The forest was dying, piece by piece, and I was helpless to stop it. Then, 2 weeks ago, the chainsaws went quiet. I drove out to the logging site to see what had happened. The crew foreman was standing by his truck, looking shaken. He told me they'd found tracks. Massive tracks, way bigger than any bear. They'd also found trees that had been deliberately pushed over, blocking the logging roads. Equipment that had been moved during the night, relocated in ways that made no sense. "Something's out there," he said, his voice low. "Something that doesn't want us here." The company suspended operations pending an investigation. They brought in a wildlife biologist who examined the tracks and declared them inconclusive. "Probably a large bear," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "The equipment could have been vandalism. Kids from town, maybe." But I knew the truth. Ripple was fighting back, protecting its home the only way it could. And it was working, at least for now. I haven't seen Ripple since that November night. Haven't found any gifts, haven't heard the calls. But I know it's out there. Some nights, when the wind is still, I can feel its presence the way you feel someone watching you in a dark room. A slight shift in the air, a sense of not being alone. The logging expansion is still on hold. The company is doing environmental impact studies, trying to prove the land is safe to clear. But the delays are adding up, and with lumber prices dropping, there's talk they might abandon the project altogether. It's not a victory, not yet, but it's hope. I'm 62 years old. My knees hurt most mornings. My hands shake when it's cold. I don't know how many more years I have left, how many more seasons I'll spend in this cabin, waiting for a glimpse of chestnut fir and a silver scar. But I know this. I saved something worth saving. And it saved me right back. People ask me sometimes why I'm still out here, why I don't move into town, find a nice apartment with central heating and neighbors who bring casseroles. And I tell them I like the quiet. I like the forest. I like being left alone. I don't tell them about Ripple. Don't tell them about the 22 years of gifts and visits, of silent companionship and cross-species loyalty. Don't tell them about the braid of hair I keep in a fireproof safe, or the fishing lure that traveled through 2 decades and came back to me as a promise. I'm telling you now because I'm tired of carrying it alone. Because I'm old enough to know that secrets die with the people who keep them, and this one deserves to live. Because maybe, somewhere out there, someone else has had an encounter like mine. Someone else has chosen protection over exposure, kindness over fear. And because I want people to understand something fundamental about the world we live in. We're not alone out here. There are other minds, other hearts, other forms of intelligence moving through these forests. They feel, they remember, they build families and pass down stories just like we do. They're capable of loyalty and gratitude and grief. They're capable of love. Ripple brought me that braid to show me something I'd forgotten in all my years of isolation. That bonds can form between the most unlikely beings. That an act of compassion, no matter how small, can echo forward through generations. That family isn't defined by species or blood, but by the choices we make and the debts we carry in our hearts. I don't know if Ripple will ever come back. I don't know if its child will remember me, or if the story of the human who saved its parent will be passed down to future generations. I don't even know if Ripple's family will survive what's coming, the logging and development and relentless expansion of human territory into the last wild places. But I know I tried. I know I chose, in that moment on the flood-swollen riverbank, to reach out instead of walk away, to protect instead of expose, to honor the trust in those dark, intelligent eyes. And I know, somewhere out in those trees, Ripple remembers too. This November, I'll turn 63. I'll sit on my porch like I always do, watching the forest, listening to the wind in the pines. I'll hold that braid in my hands and remember the weight of a tiny, terrified creature clinging to my coat, the sound of its churring, the feel of its hand gripping my forearm with impossible strength. I'll remember, and I'll wait. Because some bonds don't break, even across 2 decades and 2 worlds. Some debts never get settled. They just get carried forward, passed down, woven into the stories we tell and the memories we keep. Ripple is out there, watching over its family, teaching its child, living a life I'll never fully understand. But somewhere in that life, I exist. The human who saved it, the one who kept the secret, the one who chose again and again to protect instead of betray. We're not the only ones who remember acts of kindness, and we're not the only ones who build families around the debts we carry in our hearts. That's the truth I'm sharing now, the truth I've held for almost 22 years. Not because I want fame or recognition, not because I want to prove anything to anyone, but because in a world that's getting smaller and louder and more crowded every day, there are still mysteries worth protecting, still wild things that deserve to remain wild, still moments of connection that matter more than proof. Ripple taught me that. And maybe, if you're reading this, if you've had your own moment of impossible connection, your own choice between exposure and protection, you'll understand. Some secrets are meant to be kept, but some truths are meant to be shared. This is mine.